The wind howled a mournful symphony through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it teeth of ice that bit through worn fabric and settled bone deep. Sarah huddled tighter in the brittle hay, each breath a shallow sting in her lungs. She had found this meager shelter hours ago, guided only by the dim, fading light and the desperate prayer for anything solid against the endless white expanse. The train had left her at the desolate siding, the conductor pointing vaguely towards the distant, invisible structures that were meant to be her destination, her promised future. But the blizzard had descended with brutal speed, erasing the path, erasing hope. Now the cold was a physical weight, pressing her down, stealing warmth, stealing thought. Her fingers and toes were numb, distant parts of herself she could no longer feel. The scent of old hay and animal lingered, a faint, earthy counterpoint to the sterile, biting cold. Every creak of the aging wood, every sigh of the wind, was magnified in the terrifying silence of her isolation. She closed her eyes, picturing the worn photograph in her pocket, the stern, unfamiliar face of the man who was meant to be her husband. A man who hadn't been there, who perhaps hadn't expected her, not like this, not swallowed by the storm. Fear, sharp and primal, clawed at her throat. This was not the new beginning promised in the hopeful letters. This was the brutal, indifferent end. A sudden, sharp sound jolted her from the edge of oblivion, the heavy groan of the barn door being forced open against a drift of snow. A blast of even colder air swept in, and the weak moonlight, filtered through the swirling snow, outlined a tall, imposing figure. He stood framed in the opening for a moment, a silent, dark shape against the white chaos. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, a whimper escaping her lips, trying to disappear into the hay. Had she been found by the wrong sort? The kind the letters from home had warned against? But the figure didn't move with haste or malice. There was a stillness about him, a deliberate slowness. He closed the door, plunging the barn back into near darkness, save for the thin strips of moonlight through cracks. Then, a scrape, a flare, the sudden warm bloom of a match, illuminating his face for a fleeting second. Hard-lined, bearded, eyes that seemed to hold the same starkness as the land outside. He held a lantern, raising it slowly, scanning the interior. The light beam landed on her, huddled, trembling form. She flinched, raising a weak hand as if to ward him off. He didn't speak. He just looked, his gaze steady, unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with her fear and the low roar of the wind. He lowered the lantern slightly, and in the pool of light, she saw his hand unclench from the door handle. He took a single step towards her, then stopped. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the chasm between them vast, filled with the storm outside and the uncertainty within the barn. She watched his face, trying to decipher something, anything, in his expression. There was no welcome, no softness, but there was no immediate threat either. Only a profound, almost weary, surprise. The man who never planned to marry had just found his mail-order bride, half frozen, in his barn. He didn't offer a hand, didn't speak a comforting word. Instead, he turned and moved with quiet efficiency, setting the lantern down on a crate. The light cast dancing shadows that swallowed the corners of the barn. He untied a thick, wool blanket from a nearby saddle rack, a heavy, rough thing that smelled faintly of horse and wood smoke. Without looking directly at her, he approached and extended it, holding it loosely. Sarah hesitated, her limbs stiff with cold and terror. Was this a gesture of aid, or something else? But the cold was a more immediate, undeniable threat than the man's silent presence. Her need for warmth overcame her fear. Trembling, she reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the coarse wool. He released it instantly, letting the blanket fall into her outstretched arms. It was surprisingly heavy, radiating a faint, stored warmth. She pulled it around her shoulders, burying her face in its folds, a small, involuntary sigh escaping her lips as a sliver of comfort seeped in. He watched her for a moment longer, his face obscured by shadow, before turning away again. He moved towards a corner of the barn she hadn't noticed before, where a small, rough-hewn door was set into the wall. It was a tack room, she realized, or perhaps a lean-to built onto the main structure. He opened it, revealing a sliver of golden light and the distinct scent of wood smoke and something cooking. It was warm in there, impossibly warm compared to the barn's frigid air. He disappeared inside for a moment, then reappeared, holding a steaming mug. He carried it carefully towards her, the aroma of coffee, dark and rich, filling the air. He stopped a few feet away, holding the mug out. "Drink," he said, his voice low, a rumble that seemed unused to speaking. It was the first word he had spoken. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. They were a deep, unreadable shade in the lantern light. His expression remained neutral, offering neither kindness nor harshness, only necessity. Sarah's hands, still wrapped in the blanket, fumbled for the mug. It was hot, almost too hot to hold, but the heat seeped into her frozen fingers, a desperate blessing. She brought it to her lips, the coffee scalding but life-giving. She drank deeply, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the icy chill. He watched her drink, his posture relaxed but watchful. The silence returned, but it was different now, less menacing, filled instead with the quiet sounds of her sipping the coffee, the wind outside, and the distant crackle of a fire from the small room. She finished the mug, the last drop warming her throat. She lowered the mug, meeting his gaze tentatively. He didn't react. He simply took the empty mug from her hands, his fingers briefly brushing hers, rough, calloused. He turned and headed back towards the small door, pausing before entering. He glanced back at her, then gestured with his head towards the open doorway of the warm room. "Inside," he stated simply, before disappearing through it. Sarah hesitated for only a moment. The pull of warmth was irresistible. Clinging to the blanket, she rose on shaky legs and followed the faint light into the small, cramped, blessed warmth of his home. The room was small, barely more than a cabin built against the barn wall, but it was a sanctuary from the storm. A small, pot-bellied stove glowed red-hot in one corner, its heat radiating outwards, thawing the deep chill from her bones. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, coffee, and something simmering on the stove, a thick stew, by the smell of it. A rough wooden table occupied the center of the room, 2 chairs pulled up to it. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, covered with a worn quilt. This was the man's world, spare and functional, built for survival, not comfort. He hung her wet blanket near the stove, then gestured towards one of the chairs at the table. "Sit," his voice was still low, his words minimal. Sarah obeyed, pulling the chair out and sinking onto it, the simple act feeling like an immense relief after the ordeal. He moved to the stove, stirring the pot. The rhythmic clanking of the ladle was the only sound for a long moment. She watched him, taking in the details the barn's dim light had obscured. He was younger than the photograph suggested, perhaps in his late 30s, but the harsh lines around his eyes and mouth spoke of a life lived hard. His hair was dark, thick and slightly unruly, his hands large and capable as he worked. He didn't look at her, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He ladled the stew into a bowl, a thick, hearty mixture with chunks of meat and vegetables. He placed it before her, along with a piece of rough bread. "Eat," again, the simple command. Sarah looked at the food, her stomach cramped with hunger, a sensation she had almost forgotten in the grip of the cold. She picked up the spoon, her hand still trembling slightly, and took a hesitant bite. It was simple fare, but warm and nourishing, the flavors robust. She ate slowly at first, then with more urgency as the food began to chase away the last vestiges of the cold and fatigue. He sat down opposite her, his own bowl of stew before him, and ate in silence. The only sounds were their spoons scraping against the bowls and the cheerful crackle of the fire. There was no conversation, no explanation for her presence, no questions about her journey. It was a shared silence, not awkward, but heavy with unspoken circumstances. She finished her stew, feeling the warmth spread through her core. She glanced up at him. He was watching her, his expression still unreadable, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her look away quickly. He cleared their bowls, then poured her another mug of coffee. The storm still raged outside, rattling the walls and whistling through cracks, a constant reminder of the world they were shut away from. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked hers. They were two strangers, thrown together by fate and the brutal indifference of the wilderness. The air in the small cabin grew warmer, cozier. Sleep began to tug at her, a heavy cloak after the adrenaline of her arrival faded. He seemed to sense it. He rose and gestured towards the cot. "You can sleep there," it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, of provision. He didn't offer conversation or comfort, but he offered shelter, food, and a place to rest. In this desolate place, that was a form of profound generosity. Sarah nodded her thanks, unable to find her voice. She lay down on the narrow cot, the rough quilt surprisingly warm. He banked the fire in the stove, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. He then settled into his chair at the table, not lying down, but sitting upright, a rifle resting across his lap. He would keep watch, she realized, against the storm, against the wilderness, perhaps even against her, this unexpected, unwanted guest. As she drifted into sleep, the last thing she saw was his silhouette against the firelight, a silent, vigilant guardian in the heart of the storm. Her fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it was tempered now by a fragile thread of safety, a sense of being, for this one night, no longer utterly alone. The days that followed blurred into a quiet, rhythmic existence dictated by the storm outside and the necessities of the small cabin. The blizzard continued its relentless assault, burying the world outside in drifts that reached the cabin roof. They were trapped, two strangers in a confined space, forced into an unwilling intimacy. He was still a man of few words. His name, she learned eventually, was Silas. He worked quietly, tending the fire, melting snow for water, rationing their dwindling supply of food with meticulous care. Sarah, initially hesitant and fearful, began to find her feet. She couldn't stand idly by while he did everything. Timidly at first, she started to help, washing their few dishes in melted snow water, sweeping the small floor with a brush made of twigs, kneading the dough when he decided to bake bread. Silas didn't ask her to help, nor did he offer praise when she did. But she saw the subtle signs. A slight easing of the tension in his shoulders, a bowl left conveniently near the wash basin, a piece of bread offered without being asked. Small acknowledgments in their silent language. Her fear of him had slowly, imperceptibly, begun to recede, replaced by a cautious observation, then a quiet respect. He was hard, yes, and solitary, but he was also competent, resourceful, and, in his own understated way, protective. He never lingered near her, never touched her, kept a respectful distance. But she noticed the way his eyes would flick towards her when she wasn't looking, the way he made sure the fire was stoked high before he settled down for the night, the way he seemed to listen when she occasionally, hesitantly, spoke a few words about her journey or the life she had left behind. He rarely responded verbally, perhaps a grunt or a short, non-committal phrase, but he heard her. The harsh environment became a third character in their story, a constant external pressure that forced them to rely on each other, not out of desire, but out of sheer, desperate necessity. They were two fragile beings pitted against the overwhelming power of nature, finding a fragile strength in their unlikely pairing. One afternoon, the wind died down slightly, though the snow still fell. Silas decided he needed to check the barn roof, fearing the weight of the snow. It was a dangerous task. Sarah watched from the cabin doorway, her heart in her throat, as he climbed a makeshift ladder, disappearing onto the snow-laden roof. She could only hear the scrape of his shovel and the occasional thud of snow sliding off. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the wind and the snow. Then a sudden, sharp crack, followed by a cry. Sarah's blood ran cold. Without conscious thought, she grabbed the extra blanket hanging by the stove and lunged out into the snow, sinking knee-deep instantly. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but the fear for the silent man who had given her shelter was stronger than her own discomfort. She struggled towards the barn, the snow a treacherous obstacle course. When she reached the ladder, she saw him. He had fallen, not far, but awkwardly. His leg twisted beneath him in the deep snow. His face was grimaced in pain. He looked up at her, surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to come out. She didn't hesitate. Awkwardly, she reached him, kneeling in the snow, trying to assess the injury. He grunted. "It's twisted." I think his voice was tight with pain. It was the most she had heard him say at once. Her hands were clumsy, inexperienced, but she gently probed the area. She knew nothing of mending bones, but she knew about caring for someone in pain. "We need to get you inside," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Can you put weight on it?" He shook his head, testing the leg and drawing a sharp breath. The shared crisis, the immediate need for action, shattered the last remnants of her fear and his stoic reserve. In that moment, they were simply two people facing a difficult, dangerous problem together. Getting Silas back to the cabin was an arduous, painful process. He was heavy, and his injured leg made movement agonizingly slow through the deep snow. Sarah, though small, found a reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She half-carried, half-dragged him, her own breath coming in ragged gasps, her muscles screaming in protest. Silas, despite his pain, offered quiet instructions: where to place her hands, how to brace him. Their bodies, previously kept at a distance, were now necessarily pressed together, relying on each other's movements. A strange, intimate dance born of necessity. They finally reached the cabin door, collapsing inside, the warmth of the fire a sudden, welcome shock. Inside, the dynamic shifted. He was no longer the capable provider, but the injured, vulnerable one. Sarah took charge, her earlier timidity replaced by a quiet determination. She helped him remove his wet outer layers, built up the fire, and gently examined his leg. It was clearly injured, swollen and darkening, but thankfully, not broken. She cleaned the wound he had sustained from the fall, found some clean cloth to wrap it. Her hands moving with a gentle, focused competence, he watched with those intense, silent eyes. She prepared him a strong, bitter tea from herbs he had stored. "For the pain," he murmured, the closest he had come to expressing thanks. She helped him settle onto the cot, bringing him more blankets. The cabin, which had felt like a shared prison during the storm, now felt like a shared sickroom, bound by the quiet duties of care. For the next few days, Sarah nursed him. She changed the dressings on his leg, brought him food and water, kept the fire going. She talked to him more freely now, reading aloud from the single, worn book she had found on a shelf, a collection of stories and poems. He listened, his gaze often fixed on her face as she read. He still spoke little, but his silence felt different now, not a barrier, but a quiet, watchful presence. He began to ask her small questions about her journey, about the life she had left behind. He didn't pry, but listened intently to her answers, offering a rare nod or a thoughtful look. She, in turn, learned small things about him, that he had built this cabin himself, that he had been alone on this land for 5 years, that he had come seeking quiet and self-sufficiency. The man who never planned to marry had found himself needing the care of the woman fate had delivered to his barn. And the woman who had arrived in despair had found purpose and a surprising strength in the face of hardship. The storm outside began to relent, the wind softening, the snow easing to a gentle fall. The world outside remained white and vast, but the small cabin, and the bond forged within it through shared hardship and quiet care, felt less isolated, less bleak. The snow stopped eventually, revealing a world of pristine, blinding white under a vast, clear sky. But travel was still impossible, the drifts too deep, the paths buried. Silas's leg was slowly healing, but he was still largely immobile. Their confinement continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The fear and uncertainty had been replaced by a quiet understanding, a rhythm of shared life born of necessity and mutual respect. They ate together, shared the warmth of the fire, and talked more freely now, the sparse words carrying the weight of their shared experience. Sarah would read to him, or they would simply sit in comfortable silence, watching the light change on the snow-covered landscape visible through the small window. He spoke of his plans for the spring, for planting, for building a proper house someday. He spoke of the land, its harsh beauty, its unforgiving nature. He didn't speak of her presence here, of the circumstances that had brought her, or of the future. Not directly, but his plans for the spring, for the future of this isolated homestead, now implicitly included another person. One evening, as Sarah was tending the fire, Silas, sitting propped up on the cot, cleared his throat. She turned to look at him. His gaze was steady, serious. "Sarah," he said, her name on his lips sounding unfamiliar, yet right. "You could have stayed in the barn." Tried to ride it out, she shrugged slightly. "I was afraid," he nodded, acknowledging her honesty. "But you came out. When I fell, it wasn't a question." "You needed help," she replied simply. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. The silence was different from their earlier ones. It was charged with unspoken meaning, with the weight of choices and consequences. "I didn't expect you," he said finally, his voice low. "Didn't plan any of this." He gestured vaguely around the cabin, encompassing their shared space, their shared time. "I know," Sarah said softly. "I didn't expect this either." He held her gaze. There was no sternness now, only a deep weariness, and something else, something tentative, uncertain. "This land is hard. Takes from you, but it gives too. If you let it." He paused. "It's no place for someone who isn't willing to fight." Sarah met his gaze steadily. She had fought the cold, the fear, the despair. She had fought for him. "I've learned how to fight," she said, her voice quiet but firm. A flicker of something, respect, recognition, crossed his face. He looked away then, towards the window, towards the vast white world that stretched out beyond their small haven. "The path is buried still," he said, his voice glucked to its usual low tone. "Won't be passable for a while yet." He turned back to her, his gaze direct. "But, even when it is, you don't have to leave." The words hung in the air between them, simple, direct, lacking in grand romantic gestures, yet carrying the weight of everything they had endured together. It wasn't a proposal as she might have imagined, but a statement of possibility, a quiet offer of shared resilience in a world that demanded strength. Sarah looked at the scarred hands that had built this cabin, the eyes that had watched over her in the dark, the man who had shared his last resources, who had allowed himself to be vulnerable in her presence. The journey had been brutal, the arrival terrifying, the circumstances far from the hopeful dreams of a new life. But in the heart of the storm, she had found not just shelter, but a quiet, unexpected connection. She thought of the woman who had arrived shivering in a barn, lost and alone. She was not that woman anymore. The land had tested her, and she had bent but not broken. She looked at Silas, the stoic, solitary man whose life had been unexpectedly disrupted by her arrival. He hadn't planned for marriage, but perhaps, like her, he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for: a partner in the fight, a quiet presence in the silence, a sense of belonging not to a place but to a shared survival. Sarah smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "No," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I don't have to leave." The fire crackled. The wind sighed softly outside, and in the small cabin, two unlikely souls, forged in the crucible of hardship, found a fragile, resilient hope for a future shared on the stark, beautiful, unforgiving land.